The morning sun slipped through the high windows of the Vatican, spilling golden light across the marble floors of the music hall. The choir was already gathered, whispering softly as they prepared for something special. Today was not just another rehearsal. The Vatican had invited a pianist known across Europe, a man with exceptional skill and an attitude to match. He had played in grand halls before kings and presidents, and now he was to perform before the spiritual leader of millions, though he didn't yet know the Pope himself would attend. The choir members stood in neat rows, dressed in their robes, tuning their voices in hushed tones. At the far end of the room, a grand piano gleamed under the light, waiting. The conductor checked his watch nervously and whispered to one of the assistants that the guest pianist should be arriving any moment. The doors opened with a quiet creak. In walked the pianist, tall and confident, his footsteps echoing sharply against the marble. He carried himself with the ease of someone who knew he was talented, perhaps too much so. His suit was elegant, his smile polite but cold. He looked around the hall, eyes scanning the ceiling frescoes and ancient walls, and smirked. "So this is where the great Vatican choir performs," he said under his breath, loud enough for a few to hear. Some choir members exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen pride before, but this man carried it like armor. He approached the piano and ran his fingers lightly across the keys, testing the sound. Then he frowned slightly and said, "A little old, isn't it? I hope it can keep up," no one responded. The conductor cleared his throat and said gently, "This piano has served some of the finest musicians who've ever walked through these doors." The pianist shrugged. "Let's hope it's ready for something modern then." In the back of the room, a quiet figure entered. Pope Leo XIV, dressed simply in white, walked in without any announcement. His face was calm, almost serene, and his presence instantly changed the air in the hall. Those who noticed him bowed slightly, but he gestured softly for them to continue, as if not to interrupt. He had always believed that art revealed the truth about the soul, and he had come that morning not as a critic but as a listener. The pianist had not seen him enter. He sat down, adjusted his posture, and looked at the conductor. "Let's begin," he said. The choir started humming a low tone, preparing to accompany him. The pianist's fingers moved swiftly, striking the keys with mechanical perfection. The sound filled the room, fast and complex, but strangely hollow. His technique was flawless, each note precise, but there was something missing. The music lacked heart. As the piece continued, he grew bolder. His body swayed slightly, his face proud. He began blending his own flair into the sacred melody, turning it into something showy and theatrical. A few choir members exchanged nervous looks. It was impressive, yes, but it didn't feel right for this place. When the final note rang out, he leaned back with a satisfied smile. "There," he said. "I think that's how sacred music should sound. Alive, not buried under old traditions." A quiet murmur spread through the hall. The words hung in the air like smoke. The conductor's eyes widened slightly, and then the pianist turned and froze. Standing at the edge of the room was the Pope. The pianist's face went pale. His confidence flickered. He immediately stood up, bowing awkwardly. "Your Holiness," he stammered, I didn't know you were—" Pope Leo raised a hand gently, silencing him. His expression wasn't angry. In fact, he smiled. "Please," he said softly, "continue as you were." "I'm only here to listen." The pianist swallowed hard, his earlier pride melting into unease. He tried to speak, but the Pope continued. "Tell me, my son," he said kindly, "do you believe music is made of notes alone or of something deeper?" The pianist blinked, unsure how to respond. "Well," he said slowly, "music is sound, expression, emotion. But it must evolve, mustn't it? Old forms can be beautiful, but they shouldn't trap us." The Pope nodded slightly. "True, but tell me, when you play, do you serve the music or does the music serve you?" The pianist frowned, caught off guard by the question. He didn't answer. The room was utterly silent. Every member of the choir watched the quiet exchange. The Pope's tone was gentle, almost fatherly, yet his words carried weight. After a moment, the Pope said, "Would you play something of your own for us? Something that speaks from your heart?" The pianist hesitated, unsure what was being asked, but pride wouldn't let him refuse. He sat back down, flexed his fingers, and began to play a piece of his own composition, fast, complex, and brilliant. The notes spilled from the piano in a storm of sound. It was technical perfection, a display of mastery. But halfway through, something unexpected happened. From behind the choir, the soft, low sound of an organ began to rise. The Pope had moved quietly to the massive pipe organ and started to play. His fingers touched the keys with delicate control. The organ's sound merged with the piano's melody, not competing but guiding. At first, the pianist resisted the shift, trying to maintain his rhythm, but soon he found himself being drawn into the harmony. The Pope's playing was gentle yet powerful, weaving through his notes as if showing him another path. The pianist felt his hands slow. The bright, showy energy of his piece softened. The Pope's organ notes brought warmth, soul, and depth into what had been an empty performance. Together, their sounds filled the hall. 2 instruments, 2 hearts, 1 message. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was almost holy. No one moved. The pianist's fingers trembled on the keys. For the first time, he realized that he had just been taught a lesson, without a single word of judgment. The Pope turned from the organ and walked slowly toward him. His expression was kind but steady. "Do you feel the difference?" he asked quietly. The pianist nodded, but he couldn't find words. "Technique is a gift," said the Pope. "But when it stands alone, it is like a lamp without oil. The light may shine for a moment, but it soon fades. The heart gives it flame." The pianist looked down, his pride slipping away completely. The choir stood still, their eyes wide with admiration, not just for the Pope's playing, but for his grace. The Pope rested a hand on the pianist's shoulder and said softly, "You play beautifully, my son. But remember, music is not only to be heard. It is to be felt, shared, and given." The pianist bowed his head, humbled in a way he had never been before. He had performed for kings and nobles, but never had anyone reached his heart like this. As the Pope turned to leave, he smiled at the choir and said, "Let us continue to make music not for glory, but for grace." The choir nodded, their eyes shining. When the doors closed behind him, the pianist sat in silence for a long while. He ran his fingers across the keys again, softly this time, playing a simple hymn he remembered from childhood. It wasn't perfect. Some notes were uneven, but it was real. The choir listened quietly, and for the first time that morning the music sounded alive. The pianist didn't leave the hall right away. After the Pope departed, he sat at the piano for a long time, staring at the ivory keys as if seeing them for the first time. The room had grown quiet, the air still thick with the sound that had faded minutes ago. Some members of the choir were still there, watching him silently. No one said a word. He pressed one key, then another, almost afraid to break the silence. The notes echoed softly like whispers of something pure. His fingers no longer moved with pride. They moved with thought. He couldn't forget the way the Pope had played, the way his notes had felt alive, breathing with something deeper than skill. It was humbling yet strangely peaceful. The conductor approached quietly and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You played well today," he said carefully, as if afraid to offend. The pianist smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "No," he said softly, "I played loudly. That's not the same thing." The conductor looked at him with understanding. Sometimes it takes a great silence to teach us the meaning of sound. The pianist nodded but said nothing more. That night he couldn't sleep. The Pope's words, "Do you serve the music or does the music serve you?" kept repeating in his mind like a soft echo. He had thought of music as something to master, to control, but the Pope had played like he was listening to something beyond himself. The next morning, the pianist returned to the same hall earlier than anyone else. The sun had barely risen, and the long beams of light stretched across the floor like golden ribbons. He sat at the piano again, this time without an audience, without the need to prove anything. He closed his eyes and began to play the same piece he had performed yesterday, but slower, softer. He let each note linger, letting the emotion behind it rise instead of forcing it. When he finished, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Calm. Not triumph, not pride, but peace. He looked up and froze. Pope Leo was standing near the back of the hall again, quietly observing. For a moment, the pianist didn't know what to say. He stood quickly, bowing deeply. "Your Holiness," he said nervously, "I didn't expect—" The Pope raised a hand, smiling. "No need for that. Please continue. You play differently today." The pianist hesitated, then sat again. "I was only practicing," he said. That is when the truth of a man's heart is heard, the Pope replied. The pianist stared at the keys, unsure how to respond. Finally, he said quietly, "Yesterday I thought I knew everything about music, but when you played I realized I didn't even understand the first note." The Pope chuckled softly. Understanding is not something we reach. It is something we walk toward. Even I am still learning. He walked closer and stood beside the piano. "Tell me," he asked kindly, "why do you play?" The pianist's throat tightened. No one had ever asked him that before. "Because it's what I'm good at," he said after a pause. "It's how I've built my life." The Pope nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you feel when you play?" The pianist looked down. "I feel powerful," he admitted. "As if I can control the world for a moment." The Pope's voice softened. "And yet yesterday when you played with me you lost control but gained peace. Did you notice?" The pianist looked up, eyes wide. He remembered that moment, the way the Pope's organ had blended with his piano, how his heart had suddenly quieted. It was true. He had felt peace for the first time in years. The Pope smiled gently. "That is because you were no longer playing to impress. You were listening, and music, like faith, begins with listening." The pianist swallowed hard. He wasn't used to being taught anything outside of his art. Yet here was a man who spoke not like a critic, but like someone who saw through him entirely. "Would you play again?" the Pope asked. "Not for me. For yourself." The pianist nodded slowly and began to play a simple hymn he remembered from his childhood, something his grandmother used to hum while she cleaned. The melody was soft, innocent. As he played, he could feel the old memories rising. Warm afternoons, laughter, the smell of fresh bread. He realized he hadn't thought about those things in years. The music had brought them back, not with grandeur but with gentleness. When he finished, the Pope's eyes glistened slightly. "That," he said, "is music." The pianist looked confused. "But it was so simple." "Yes," said the Pope, "and in simplicity truth hides. People often think beauty is found in perfection. But beauty lives in sincerity." The pianist lowered his gaze, ashamed. "Yesterday I was proud," he said. "I spoke disrespectfully about your music, about tradition." The Pope shook his head. "There is no need to dwell on pride. The important thing is what follows after." He smiled warmly and continued. "I have seen many men change their hearts after a song. Music does not need to be perfect, it needs to be honest. You have a gift and now you know how to use it differently." The pianist sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the keys. "I want to learn that," he said finally. "To play honestly." The Pope placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then stay for a while. Play with the choir tomorrow. Let your heart learn through others. When people sing together, even strangers become one." The pianist nodded, emotion filling his chest. He had never been invited to play alongside others without being the center of attention. The thought made him both nervous and excited. That night he joined the choir's rehearsal. At first the singers looked hesitant. They still remembered his arrogance from the day before. But when he began to play, their doubts slowly faded. His notes were calm, patient, and respectful. He followed their rhythm instead of leading it. For the first time the music felt alive. The choir master smiled faintly, sensing the change. The pianist caught his eye, and they shared a quiet nod of understanding. As the song ended, the choir members applauded softly, not for his skill, but for his humility. He didn't bow or smile proudly this time. He simply looked grateful. When he returned to his small guest quarters that night, he sat by the window, looking out at the Vatican lights. He could hear faint echoes of the choir practicing in the distance. Their voices rose and fell like waves. For the first time, he didn't feel alone among them. He thought about how strange it was. A single moment of humiliation had become a doorway to peace. The Pope could have scolded him, could have embarrassed him in front of everyone. Instead, he had guided him gently, letting the music itself deliver the lesson. The pianist realized something that night. He had spent his whole life chasing applause, thinking that the louder the claps, the greater his worth. But the Pope had taught him that silence could be the most powerful response of all. As he drifted to sleep, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I will play not to be heard, but to be felt." Morning came quietly. The air smelled of incense and early rain. The pianist walked back into the hall where everything had begun. The choir was already waiting, their faces warm this time, not cautious. The Pope entered moments later, smiling as he saw the pianist at the piano again, "Are you ready?" he asked softly. The pianist nodded. "Yes, Your Holiness." "Then play," said the Pope, "and let your heart speak." The pianist closed his eyes. His fingers touched the keys with a tenderness that surprised even him. The choir joined in, their voices rising gently, blending with his music in perfect harmony. For the first time, he wasn't performing. He was praying through sound. When the last note faded, no one spoke. The Pope's eyes were closed and the choir stood in stillness. It was as if the entire room had exhaled at once. The pianist opened his eyes slowly. The Pope smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and whispered, "Now, the music lives." The sound of the final note lingered in the air, fading slowly into silence. No one moved. The choir stood perfectly still, their hands folded, their eyes fixed on the piano. The Pope's eyes were closed, his expression calm, almost like he was still listening to something that hadn't ended yet. The pianist sat there, his fingers resting lightly on the keys, afraid to move or even breathe. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped inside the hall. Then the Pope opened his eyes. His gaze met the pianist's and a soft smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a smile of pride or amusement, it was one of peace. He didn't clap or speak right away. He just nodded once as if to say, "You have finally understood." The pianist slowly took his hands off the piano and sat back, his heart pounding quietly. He had played hundreds of performances before, big stages, bright lights, roaring crowds, but never had he felt anything like this. There had been no applause, no noise, and yet it was the most powerful response he had ever received. The Pope finally spoke, his voice gentle but steady. "Do you feel it now?" he asked. The pianist swallowed hard. "I think I do," he whispered. "What do you feel?" The pianist thought for a long moment before answering. "It's quiet," he said slowly, "but not empty. It's like the music is still here even after it stopped." The Pope nodded. "That is when the music becomes prayer. It doesn't end when the sound ends." The choir remained silent, each of them touched in their own way by what they had just witnessed. Some of them had sung in this hall for years, but they had never seen such a transformation. The man who had entered with pride now looked humble, almost fragile yet stronger in spirit than before. The Pope turned to the choir and said softly, "You see, every note we sing is a gift. When we give it with pride, it fades, but when we give it with love, it stays." His words filled the room like a soft echo, settling deep inside everyone's heart. After a pause, the Pope turned back to the pianist. "Walk with me," he said. The pianist stood quickly, uncertain but obedient. Together they walked out of the music hall and down one of the long marble corridors of the Vatican. Their footsteps echoed softly, the faint scent of incense still hanging in the air. Through tall windows, sunlight poured in, washing the hall in a warm glow. The Pope spoke quietly as they walked. "Many people mistake skill for greatness," he said. "But greatness is not in how loudly the world applauds you. It is in how deeply the world is touched by your silence." The pianist listened carefully. Every word felt like a truth he had been blind to for years. "I think I've been chasing the wrong thing all my life," he said quietly. The Pope smiled. "Perhaps, but it takes courage to see that. Many never do." They stopped near the courtyard where the sound of distant bells filled the air. The Pope looked toward the sky and said, "Do you know why the choir sings every morning?" The pianist shook his head. "It is not for me," said the Pope. "Not for the church, not even for the people. They sing to remind themselves that gratitude has a voice. Every song is a thank you whispered to heaven." The pianist felt a lump rise in his throat. He thought about how he had always performed for applause, for recognition, for fame. He had forgotten the pure joy of just playing for the sake of playing. "Can I ever change that?" he asked quietly. The Pope turned to him, his eyes kind but serious. "You already have," he said. "The moment you felt your music breathe, you changed. The rest is just practice." They walked back slowly. When they returned to the hall, the choir was still there, softly discussing the performance. When they saw the Pope and the pianist return, they grew quiet again. The Pope looked at them and said, "Tomorrow this man will play again, this time for all of you, and this time you will listen not for his talent, but for his truth." The choir nodded respectfully, their faces filled with curiosity. The pianist felt both nervous and honored. He hadn't been asked to perform again since the first day, when everything had gone wrong. But this felt different. That evening, he sat alone in his quarters with the window open. The air was cool, and the faint sound of church bells echoed in the distance. He placed his hands on the small wooden desk, thinking about the day. Every word the Pope had said replayed in his mind like a melody. He thought about his past concerts, the lights, the applause, the standing ovations, and realized how empty they suddenly seemed. All those moments had filled his ego, not his soul. Tonight he felt something different, something real. He reached for the small notebook he carried everywhere, one that he used to jot down melodies and ideas. He turned to a blank page and wrote just one line, "Play not for the ears but for the hearts." Then he closed the book and smiled faintly. The next morning he rose early. The Vatican was quiet except for the distant murmur of morning prayers. He dressed simply, leaving behind his usual polished suit for something humbler. When he entered the music hall, the choir was already warming up, their voices rising softly in harmony. The Pope entered shortly after, walking slowly but gracefully. His presence still carried that same calm strength, the kind that filled the room without words. He looked at the pianist and nodded. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. "Yes," the pianist said. His voice was steady this time. He sat at the piano and closed his eyes. The hall was filled with sunlight now, beams of gold shining through the stained glass windows. The air felt sacred, like it was waiting for something beautiful to happen. The Pope raised his hand slightly and the choir began with a soft hum. The pianist joined in, his fingers gliding across the keys, not with speed but with emotion. The notes were simple, yet every one of them carried feeling. The music built slowly, the choir's voices weaving perfectly with the piano, rising like a prayer shared among hearts. There was no need to show off. No rush, no struggle, just music, pure and honest. As they played, some of the choir members began to tear up. The pianist felt his chest tighten, not from pride but from something deeper, connection. For the first time he understood what the Pope had meant. The music wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone in the room. When the song ended, there was silence again. Not the heavy kind, but peaceful, like the sound of still water after rain. The Pope looked around at everyone and said softly, "This is what harmony means, not just in sound, but in spirit." The pianist's eyes filled with tears. He lowered his head, unable to speak. The Pope walked closer and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You have learned what few ever do," he said. "You were humbled but not broken. That is strength." The pianist looked up, and for the first time in his life he smiled without pride, only gratitude. The choir began to softly applaud, their faces glowing with emotion. Some wiped their eyes. It wasn't the performance they were applauding. It was the transformation. The Pope turned to them all and said, "Remember this day. Remember that true greatness comes not from how well you play, but from how deeply you love what you give." That moment stayed with everyone in that hall. Even years later, the story would be told again and again, not about how the Pope humbled a proud musician, but how he lifted him instead. Later that night, as the pianist prepared to leave the Vatican, he took one last walk through the quiet corridors. The sound of distant hymns filled the air, faint but beautiful. He paused near the chapel door and listened. He smiled to himself and whispered softly, "Now I understand." Then he walked out into the moonlight, his steps light and sure, carrying with him not just the memory of music, but its true meaning. The next morning, the pianist woke before dawn. The faint light of the rising sun slipped through the window of his small Vatican room, touching the edge of his piano sheet like a whisper. He sat up slowly, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet eagerness, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the chance to play again. He washed his face with cold water, put on a simple white shirt, and walked to the same music hall that had changed his life only days ago. The halls were empty, the air calm and cool. His footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor as he entered the great room. The piano stood there in the middle, waiting for him like an old friend. He walked toward it, touched its polished surface, and smiled faintly. He remembered how he had once complained that it was too old. Now it seemed timeless. He sat down, pressed one key, then another, just to feel the sound rise and fall. The music was soft, imperfect, but alive. It felt honest. A few minutes later, he heard quiet footsteps behind him. He turned and saw the Pope entering slowly, hands folded behind his back, a warm smile on his face. "You start your day early," the Pope said gently. The pianist stood up quickly. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "My mind was full of melodies." "That is a good sign," the Pope replied. "It means your heart is awake." The pianist smiled shyly. "I just wanted to play again, to feel what I felt yesterday." The Pope walked closer. "Then play," he said. "Not for me. For the morning itself. Let your music greet the light." The pianist nodded and sat again. He began to play a soft piece, slow, gentle, full of emotion. The Pope closed his eyes and listened quietly. The sunlight grew stronger as the music filled the room, touching the golden edges of the floor, the walls, and the Pope's white robes. When the song ended, the Pope said softly, "You see, when your music comes from peace, it creates peace." The pianist lowered his head. "I wish I had learned this long ago," he said. "Every lesson has its own hour," the Pope replied. "And yours came exactly when it should." The rest of the morning passed quietly. The pianist practiced with the choir again, this time with more confidence, but not the kind of confidence that comes from ego. It was quiet confidence built on understanding. The choir welcomed him like one of their own. They laughed between songs, shared stories, and even teased him gently about his earlier arrogance. He took it all with a smile. The man who once demanded attention was now content simply to blend in. The Pope watched from a distance, pleased. He saw not a performer, but a man who had learned how to listen. Later that week, a special event was announced, a Sunday Mass that would be open to the public, where the choir would perform. The Pope wanted the pianist to play alongside them. When he heard the news, the pianist felt nervous again. He hadn't played for a large audience since his transformation. But this time, the thought of performing didn't make him feel proud or anxious. It made him feel grateful. He wanted to share what he had learned, not show it off. The night before the performance, he couldn't sleep again, but for a different reason. He wasn't worried about failure, he was lost in thought. He sat by his window looking at the glowing lights of the Vatican courtyard. The wind carried faint echoes of choir voices practicing late into the night. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, let my music belong to them, not me." The next morning, the Vatican was filled with people. The great church shimmered with candles, golden light pouring through tall stained glass windows. The air was filled with soft whispers, the rustle of robes and the sound of footsteps echoing across marble floors. The pianist took his place at the piano, his heart beating fast. The choir stood behind him, ready. The Pope entered and took his seat, nodding quietly at the pianist as if to say, "Just breathe." He took a deep breath, placed his fingers on the keys, and began. The opening notes were soft, so soft that some people leaned forward just to hear. Slowly, the choir joined in, their voices blending like threads of light. The pianist played with all his heart, every note filled with meaning. He wasn't performing anymore. He was sharing something deeply human. The music rose and fell like a tide, flowing through every corner of the great hall. Some listeners closed their eyes. Some smiled. Others wept quietly. Even the echo of the piano seemed to sing. For the first time in his life, the pianist wasn't thinking about himself at all. He felt like his hands were simply the bridge between something higher and the people listening. Every sound he created felt like a prayer, one that asked for nothing but peace. As the song reached its peak, the choir's voices soared, surrounding his melody in warmth and harmony. The Pope closed his eyes, his hands clasped together in silent prayer. The light through the windows grew brighter, as if the morning itself was listening. And then, just as gently as it began, the music came to an end. The pianist lifted his hands slowly, letting the final note fade into stillness. No one spoke. The silence felt sacred. Then from the back of the church, a soft sob broke the stillness. Someone crying quietly, moved beyond words. Others began to wipe their eyes. The Pope opened his eyes and looked at the pianist. His expression said everything. The pianist bowed his head, not out of pride but deep gratitude. After a long pause, the Pope rose to his feet. The crowd stood too, following his lead. But instead of clapping, they remained silent. It wasn't a silence of emptiness, it was full, like a shared heartbeat. When the Pope finally spoke, his voice was gentle but carried through the entire hall. Music, he said, is the language of the soul. Today we did not hear a performance. We heard a prayer. The choir bowed their heads. The pianist's eyes filled with tears. After the mass, people came forward to thank the choir. Many stopped to speak with the pianist, their faces glowing with emotion. A woman told him she hadn't felt peace in years until she heard the song. An old man said the music reminded him of his late wife. Every person spoke from the heart, and each word touched him more deeply than any award or applause ever had. When the crowd finally dispersed, the Pope approached the pianist once more. The church was quiet now, the candles burning low. "You played beautifully," the Pope said softly. The pianist shook his head. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was the music. It felt like it came through me." The Pope smiled knowingly. "Then you have truly learned." They stood in silence for a while. Then the Pope added, "You see, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less." You let go and the music flowed freely. The pianist nodded slowly, taking in every word. That night, he walked through the Vatican courtyard alone. The sky was clear, and the stars shimmered like tiny lights above the ancient stone walls. He sat on a bench listening to the faint sounds of the city beyond. For the first time, he felt no need to be anywhere else, no desire to chase fame or applause. He closed his eyes and whispered a small prayer of thanks, not for success, but for peace. In that quiet moment, he finally understood what the Pope had taught him all along. The greatest music is not played with hands, but with the heart. And as he sat there under the stars, the memory of the day replayed in his mind. The choir's harmony, the sunlight through the windows, the Pope's calm smile. He knew that his life and his music would never be the same again. The morning after the grand performance, the Vatican was quieter than usual. The streets that had been filled with visitors and music lovers the day before were now calm. The air carried the faint scent of candle wax and flowers that had been placed in the church after the Mass. Everything felt slower, softer, as if the whole place was resting after something holy had passed through it. The pianist woke early again. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, staring at his hands. They looked the same as always, yet he couldn't stop thinking about how differently they had played yesterday. It felt like something inside him had changed forever. He had played with truth, not pride, and for the first time in his life he felt free. He got dressed and walked toward the small courtyard garden near the Pope's residence. The morning light was warm and golden, birds hopping between the old stone fountains. He sat quietly on a bench watching the water ripple. He didn't know the Pope was already there, sitting on the far side, reading a small book. When the Pope looked up and saw him, he smiled. "You're awake early again," he said. The pianist nodded. "I couldn't stay in bed. My mind is still full of yesterday." The Pope closed his book gently. Yesterday was not just a performance. It was a moment of awakening for you, for the choir, and for everyone who heard. The pianist lowered his eyes. "I never expected it to move people like that. I wasn't trying to impress anyone." "That," said the Pope softly, "is why it did." They both smiled quietly. A few moments passed in silence before the Pope said, "Do you know what the choir said after the Mass?" The pianist shook his head. "They told me that when you played, they felt lifted, as if their voices were guided by your heart. They said they sang better because you listened to them instead of leading them." The pianist looked surprised. "They said that?" "Yes," said the Pope. "And I told them that is how harmony is born, when everyone forgets who is leading and who is following." The pianist leaned back and looked up at the sky. The clouds were slowly moving, breaking into soft shapes. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I used to believe I had to be the best. I thought music was about being admired. But yesterday, I didn't care about that anymore. I just wanted people to feel peace." The Pope nodded gently. "True art always carries peace, not pride. You have learned what many never do." A soft breeze passed between them, carrying the faint sound of the choir practicing in the distance. Their voices rose and fell like waves, gentle and calm. The Pope listened for a moment and said, "They are practicing again for next week's service. I told them you will be joining them." The pianist smiled. "Of course. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." Later that morning, he joined the choir in the Great Hall. When he walked in, they clapped softly, not out of formality but out of warmth. Their faces were different now, no trace of the tension or awkwardness that once filled the room. The pianist felt like part of a family. One of the choir members said, "We've been waiting for you. The music feels empty without your piano," he laughed. "Then let's fill it again." They began their rehearsal. The music flowed naturally, almost effortlessly. Every note seemed to connect, every voice found its place. The pianist didn't have to control or direct. He simply followed the rhythm of the choir, letting the music move through him. For the first time, the rehearsal felt like a conversation instead of a competition. The choir sang with more emotion, more unity. Even the youngest members looked inspired. When the last note ended, everyone stayed still for a moment, smiling quietly at one another. "That was beautiful," someone whispered. The pianist turned to the group and said softly, "It's beautiful because it's honest. That's what people feel. It's not the sound, it's the truth behind it." The choir nodded, understanding him completely. That afternoon, the Pope called a small meeting inside his study. The pianist and the choir director were invited. The Pope looked pleased, sitting behind his wooden desk surrounded by old books and warm light. "I have been thinking," he began. "Yesterday's performance touched not only the hearts of those who attended, but also those who heard about it. Letters have already arrived this morning, from people saying the music brought them peace, even those who only listened from outside the church." He paused and looked at the pianist. "Your journey has reminded many of what humility means. I want to do something special. I would like you to compose a new piece, something for the Vatican's annual peace service next month." The pianist looked surprised, even overwhelmed. "You want me to write a piece for that? That's such an honor." "It is not an honor," said the Pope gently. "It is a responsibility. Write it not for fame, but for peace. Let the same spirit that guided you yesterday guide your hands again." The pianist bowed his head. "I'll do my best." "I know you will," said the Pope. The days that followed were filled with quiet work. The pianist spent long hours at his piano, experimenting with melodies. Some nights he couldn't find the right sound and would stop to walk in the garden, listening to the wind, the bells, and the quiet prayers of those passing by. He wanted the music to carry the same peace he had felt that day in the Great Hall. Sometimes he would visit the choir and ask them to sing while he played ideas. Their voices helped him find the right balance, gentle, strong, humble. Slowly, the song began to take shape. It wasn't grand or complex. It was simple, filled with calm emotion, like sunlight filtering through old windows. When he finished the last page of the composition, he felt a deep stillness inside. He took the music to the Pope, who read it carefully. Then, without a word, the Pope nodded and smiled. "It is perfect," he said. "It feels like a prayer." When the day of the peace service came, people gathered again, just as before. The church glowed with candlelight, and a quiet anticipation filled the air. The pianist sat at his piano. The choir stood ready, and the Pope looked on with a serene expression. As the first note sounded, the room fell silent. The music was soft at first, almost fragile. The choir joined in, their voices floating like air. There was no tension, no rush, only calmness that grew slowly, gently spreading through everyone who listened. People closed their eyes. Some smiled, some wept, and others simply breathed deeply as if releasing something heavy they had carried too long. The Pope sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, his face peaceful. When the final note faded, there was silence again, beautiful, unbroken silence. Then the Pope stood and said softly, "This is the sound of peace." The audience didn't clap at first. They simply stood still, letting the music linger in their hearts. Then slowly they began to applaud, not wildly but with deep respect. It wasn't applause for entertainment. It was gratitude. The pianist looked around and saw faces full of emotion. He didn't feel proud. He felt thankful. He turned to the choir, smiled, and bowed slightly. The choir bowed back. It felt like they were all part of something far greater than themselves. After the service, the Pope approached him again, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You have done well," he said softly. "You have turned your talent into a gift. Remember this, music that serves the heart will always outlive music that serves the ego." The pianist's eyes grew wet. "Thank you for believing in me," he whispered. The Pope smiled. "I didn't just believe in you. I believed in what was inside you, the part that needed to be found." As the night settled, the Vatican lights glowed softly against the dark sky. The pianist walked through the empty hall, his footsteps echoing faintly. He stopped by the piano and ran his fingers along the keys. They felt warm beneath his touch, like they held the memory of every song he had played. He whispered quietly, "Thank you," as if speaking to the instrument itself. When he stepped outside, the air was cool and calm. The stars shimmered above the domes and the bells of the city chimed softly in the distance. He knew that his journey had come full circle, from pride to humility, from competition to connection, from noise to peace. The next morning, the choir gathered again for rehearsal. The pianist joined them, smiling warmly. They began singing a new hymn together, and their voices carried gently through the halls. Somewhere nearby, the Pope paused as he walked by and listened. He smiled to himself. He didn't need to see them to know. They were singing from the heart. And as the sunlight filled the room again, it felt like the music would never end.